Greetings, friends. This is Dana Ullman giving a talk today on J.D. Rockefeller's deep love for homeopathy. Though that's the shortened version of this particular presentation, the longer and more accurate title is J.D. Rockefeller's deep love for homeopathy, his financial support for conventional medicine. The story behind how homeopathy lost its once highly significant popularity in America and the world. And what's very unique about this presentation, it will answer the question that we all know that homeopathy is a remarkable system of healing. It may not cure everyone, but in my practice, I see a miracle multiple times a day. So what happened to it? Why wasn't it maintaining that same degree of popularity or an even greater popularity? And this presentation answers these questions. And very few other presentations do on this subject. Now, for those people that know me, you know I've written many books because I believe that there's certain key things that we must do to grow homeopathy in the world. And of course, one of the primary things that I've spent a bunch of my time doing is teaching the average human being how to use homeopathic medicines, how to use a homeopathic medicine kit. Because once you teach people to do these things, to take more power and control of their own health and that of their family, they begin to see the miracles that homeopathy provides. I also am a big advocate of educating people on the research side of homeopathy, because that too is really good for reducing the skepticism that people have. Of course, the biggest way to reduce the skepticism is for people to have a personal experience. That is the most important way. But to get them to have that experience, to get them to be even open to trying homeopathy, research is one very important way. And in my ebook, which I'll discuss at the very end of this presentation, I have, as of the year 2024, over 500 clinical trials published in peer-reviewed medical journals. So that when people say that there's no scientific evidence that homeopathy works, that is if you close your eyes and refuse to learn. There is a really quite significant body of evidence that homeopathy works. But another way to open people's minds and hearts to homeopathy is knowing something about history, because history is full of evidence for the amazing work and efficacy of homeopathy. And conventional medicine did not attain its power and popularity because it was more effective. That's certainly not true. And it certainly wasn't because it was more scientific, as this presentation will show. So let's get right into it, okay? Now, before I get to Rockefeller, however, I have a big run-up. I need to provide context, historical context for things that were happening at that time that I think you will find quite compelling. So here is this disclaimer, blah, 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 because I'm not providing clinical information. You know, this disclaimer isn't that helpful, but upward and onward. So the founding of the American Medical Association took place in 1847, 3 years after the foundation of the first National Medical Society of the United States, which was the American Institute of Homeopathy. It's not that the homeopaths were larger in number, they weren't, but they were some of the most established and most respected members of society at the time, as were their patients. So they saw a real interest in creating a national society. And the AMA, when they did create themselves, asserted in their own charter that one of the reasons for the formation was to slow the growth of homeopathic medicine. They were so concerned about this that even just a couple years later, from 1816 all the way through 1910, the AMA established within their code of ethics something called the consultation clause, which asserted that if an AMA member, they'd lose the membership in the AMA if they simply consulted with a homeopath or any non-regular practitioner. And what's interesting is that a physician could be taking powerful drugs, could be having sex with their patients, could be killing their patients, could be prescribing dangerous drugs, as they did as a matter of course. But none of those ethical codes were ever enforced. The only one really that was ever enforced was if a physician chose to consult with a homeopathic physician for a patient. And believe it or not, one husband, one man, his MD, lost his membership in the MA because he consulted with his wife, who happened to be a homeopath. And on the night of Lincoln's assassination, this was a part of a plot. It wasn't just John Wilkes Booth killing Lincoln, because on that same evening, Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, got a knock at the door from a person who claimed he had a delivery from Seward's homeopathic physician. And because Seward was such a well-known advocate for homeopathy, that was a brilliant excuse to get in the door. And once the messenger got into his bedroom, he took out his gun and shot Seward, but the gun didn't work. So he ended up taking out a knife and he stabbed him 7 times. As it turns out, they never did catch the assassin. But as it turns out, Seward did live. They found the Surgeon General of America happened to be the closest physician at the time to Seward, who was able to help keep Seward alive and then ultimately call in Seward's personal physician, who was a homeopath. But because the Surgeon General of America aided in the treatment of a homeopathic patient, he was reprimanded for doing so. Reprimanded. But the story of the New York State Medical Society really takes the case. Are you ready for this? All right. In 1882, the AMA actually expelled the entire New York Medical Society from the national organization because this state society had recently passed a resolution that recognized all properly graduated doctors, thereby including homeopathic physicians. And in response, this state society's decision, the AMA threw out the New York State Medical Society and created an alternative organization. There were 2 separate medical organizations that persisted for 22 years, all the way until 1906. So now, just to give you a context, the president of the AMA in 1903, in his presidential address to the AMA, stated, quote, drugs, with the exception of quinine in malaria and mercury in syphilis, are valueless as cures. Now, Sir William Osler, who was the chief of clinical medicine at Johns Hopkins, and then a little bit later got bumped upstairs to be head of Oxford University. But before he got to Oxford, he was a strict critic of what conventional medicine was doing. And I'll get into that. And I love this quote also at this 1903 AMA convention. And this doctor says, "We fought the homeopath because he came into the community and got the business." That is the real reason they were antagonistic to homeopathy. Homeopathy was its leading competitor. So what happened? Well, in 1899, the AMA hired George H. Simmons to become the head of the AMA, what ended up being a 25-year reign. And he came up with a brilliant idea. And I should also mention that he not only became the head of the AMA, became editor of the journal of the AMA, also called JAMA. And he came up with a brilliant idea to transform the AMA into a big business by creating the AMA seal of approval on drugs. Now, to get the seal of approval, you do not have to prove safety or efficacy. Yeah. Okay. But they did require one thing that was very good. To get the seal of approval, you had to say what was in your medicine. You couldn't have a secret formula. And in the 19th century and early 20th century, there were some medical products that had a secret formula. So that was a good benefit. But the other requirement to get the AMA seal of approval on drugs and thus be able to advertise in JAMA was that you had to agree to advertise in virtually every local, regional, and national AMA publication. And you had to agree that you were not going to advertise your products to the public. This was a brilliant way for the AMA to really just get all of the drug companies' advertisements. And this made them rich. How rich? Let's talk about that. In 1900, the AMA membership was a paltry 8,000 people, 8,000 physicians. But in just 10 years, it had grown to 70,000. And JAMA's advertising revenue in 1900 was a paltry $34,000 a year. And in 9 years, it had grown to 150,000 and growing. Well, what changed? Well, this AMA seal of approval on drugs was a collaboration then between the AMA and the pharmaceutical industry. So now, at that time, there was certain challenges in American medicine. There were some medical schools that were 2-year and some others 3-year and some 4-year medical schools. There were allopathic medical schools, there were homeopathic medical schools, there were osteopathic, chiropractic, naturopathic, and even this type called eclectic school of medicines, which is really an interesting, I mean, that's the ultimate, like what we would call today integrative medicine, where they taught conventional medicine, but they taught the students homeopathy and botanical medicine and nutrition. And so it was really a holistic system. But the assumption behind the Flexner report was there should be just one uniform standard for creating physicians. And I'll explain how and why there's a certain logic they had to that. But it's not a logic that would create a healthy America. It would be one that would help to support a monopolization of medicine by one group of doctors, and usually of one sex, and usually of one racial group. So at that time, here were some of the homeopathic medical schools. Boston University, New York Medical College was called New York Homeopathic Medical College. University of Michigan had both an allopathic school of medicine and a homeopathic school of medicine. University of Minnesota, even in middle of America, University of Iowa. And how can I not list Hahnemann Medical College in Philadelphia? And 4 of the 5 largest medical school libraries had homeopathic medical colleges, of course. And homeopathic medical schools admitted women several decades before the allopathic medical schools did. So now the Flexner report was issued by the Carnegie Foundation as a plan to have what would seem to be an independent observer make decisions. But the question we must ask, was Abraham Flexner really an independent observer? Well, at the time, he was chosen because he wasn't involved with medicine in any shape, way, or form. So he wouldn't be known to have a point of view on the subject. But he was the brother of Simon Flexner, who worked for Frederick Gates of the Rockefeller Foundation. And we'll find more information about Frederick Gates and Simon Flexner very shortly. Okay, so for Flexner to have visited 155 medical colleges and the 12 postgraduate medical schools in the United States and Canada in a 16-month period, he had to spend just about a day at every school. And he made many of the visits, actually, with an AMA representative. The guy that was really like one of the number 2 people at the AMA, Nathan Caldwell, who was head of the Council on Medical Education. And the AMA was known to have bragged just prior to the publication of the Flexner report that the AMA provided far more guidance in this famous survey than is generally known. That's right. They wanted to hide that fact. And what I've uncovered this is one of many smoking guns. We've got a smoking machine gun. You'll see. Okay, so the implications of what happened with the Flexner report is that it ultimately recommended the closing of all the women's medical colleges, but all but 1 were indeed closed. 5 of the 7 Black medical schools closed. 22 homeopathic medical schools existed in 1900, but dwindled to just 2 by 1923. And the naturopathic, eclectic, and chiropractic schools experienced similar fate. all the medical schools teaching homeopathy were forced to change their curriculum to follow the guidelines promoted by Flexner. So Osler, Sir William Osler, had a strong critique of Flexner. He described Flexner as having, quote, a very feeble grasp of medicine. And there were so many errors in the report that he was unable to say whether it was the result of unfairness or ignorance, and was more prevalent, but in any case, a gross injustice was done. Yeah, yeah. So now, as it turns out, Flexner and Gates both strongly contended that only the larger medical schools should continue to exist. However, between 1900 and 1905, the homeopathic graduates had a 9% failure rate for the medical board exams, and the conventional graduates had a 16% failure rate, almost twice as much. In 1912, the medical students who took the state licensing exam found that the larger medical school didn't have a higher percentage of students who passed. And further, Boston University, which was the homeopathic medical school, had a failure rate of only 3.3%, while Harvard had a failure rate of almost 12%, literally 4 times a higher rate. So now what's so interesting is there was another leader of leaders in American medicine. His name is Harvey Cushing, and he was a neurosurgeon and pathologist. And he's the doctor for whom the disease Cushing's disease is named after. And he joined with Osler in this sharp critique of the Flexner report. However, according to a review that was published in 2011, which was a review of the Flexner report after 100 years, Duffy notes that Osler's and Cushing's critique was, quote, were hushed by the irresistible seduction of large sums of money. And that's where we're going to lead into talking about Rockefeller soon, but hold on for just a little bit longer. So, Abraham Flexner then was given a job to work for one of the Rockefeller foundations, where he worked tirelessly to augment the reforms that he had recommended. And this grant-giving organization provided $500 million from 1910 to 1930. And $500 million in that time frame would be akin to $500 billion. So one of the things that led to the downfall of Simmons, and this is quite remarkable, there was a guy named Wallace Abbott, and he created Abbott Laboratories, which is a big pharma company that has persisted to today. And he would not give Simmons what he called shakedown money in order to get permission to advertise his drugs and to get the AMA seal of approval. Instead of paying these fees, Abbott hired an investigator who researched Simmons's life, and he found out that Simmons claimed to have gotten his medical degree from a hospital in Ireland that didn't provide medical degrees. He also discovered that Simmons attended a homeopathic medical school in Chicago, practiced homeopathy for 10 years, during which time he actively advertised his practice at a time that the AMA discouraged their members from advertising. The only good thing I can say about him is that he also advertised that he provided abortion care, which of course is a questionable thing to do for physicians at that time. But I bless him for that. But, he did that just to keep his, another source of income going on. So, Abbott Laboratories was able to advertise. But part of his investigator discovered something else. They discovered that, according to Simmons' former wife, that Simmons tried to poison her and then get her committed to an insane asylum. And this is such a classic story. There was a famous movie called Gaslight, and the term gaslight is based on what the former head of the AMA did to his wife, of making her crazy by poisoning her and then committing her to an insane asylum so that he can then marry someone else. So when this came out, Simmons was forced to resign. And what did he do? He immediately burned all of his files. But the AMA, being resilient as it is, they hired his protege to take over the AMA, Morris Fishbein. And Fishbein was so impressed with the AMA seal of approval on drugs that he created the AMA seal of approval on foods. That if you just followed the simple guidelines that the AMA provided, in other words, agree to advertise in so many of the AMA publications, you would get their approval. And that's what created the cozy relationship the AMA had with the tobacco industry. And in fact, during Fishbein's 25-year reign, also all the way until 1949, he never allowed any negative research on tobacco to be published in JAMA. Though within 6 months of him being kicked out of the AMA, JAMA began publishing anti-tobacco research. But what does Fishbein do? He becomes, of course, a lobbyist for tobacco. And what is so stunning is today, at the University of Chicago, an esteemed university, there is the Fishbein Center for Medical History. So here is a man that I would call one of the Mussolinis of American medicine, and the University of Chicago honors him with an institute. I mean, why don't we call it, the Hitler or Mussolini Institute for the History of Medicine? I mean, it's akin to that. It's that much of an embarrassment. And here's a story about Charles Kettering that I got to make mention of. Kettering, earlier in his life, he grew up in Ohio, and there was the National Cash Register Company, and he was the guy that was the scientist, the inventor. He is only second to Edison for more patents, and he made the cash register electronic. So General Motors was so impressed with his work there that they had him become vice president of General Motors, where he created the Delco battery that still persists today. And so he made cars electronic. And so he only sought homeopathic care. His own personal physician was Thomas Addison McCain, who some of you may know. I mean, because if you've read anything about homeopathy during the 1918 flu pandemic, McCain was known to have reported on 24,000 cases of the flu treated in conventional hospitals and having a mortality rate of 28%, while 26,000 cases of flu treated in homeopathic hospitals had a mortality rate of only 1%. So McCain was a really respected homeopath and physician. And because of Kettering's appreciation for homeopathy, he, in 1920, gave $1 million to Ohio State University, with it tagged for the homeopathic medical school and for creating a research laboratory. But immediately upon this news, Colwell, who was secretary of the AMA's Committee on Medical Education, visited the president of Ohio State and gave him an ultimatum that if he didn't return that $1 million back to Kettering, that the AMA would grade the Ohio State University in a lower ranking, that they would no longer be able to attract students. And it was because of this pressure that the Board of Trustees of Ohio State actually returned their $1 million grant, which in 1922 money would be like $1 billion. Kettering ended up using that money instead to create the Sloan Kettering Institute. And although he would have wanted it to be investigating homeopathic and energy medicine concepts, it went the other direction. So now this leads us up to good old Rockefeller, who lived to a ripe old age of 97, 50 years of which was under the care of homeopathic physicians. And initially, his homeopath was Myra King Merritt, who was the first woman doctor in Ohio, and she helped establish the Cleveland Homeopathic Hospital College for Women in 1867. And I love the fact that Rockefeller was progressive enough, and you'll see in many ways how progressive he was. But what happened to that progressiveness? And Merrick, by the way, her specialty was obstetrics, so she even delivered Rockefeller's kids, including his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. But ultimately, later in the 1890s, Rockefeller began going to what became his closest friend and neighbor, a homeopathic doctor named Hamilton Fisk Biggar, who lived to a good old 87 years old. And even his golfing buddy, and during the last several decades of each of their lives, were known to travel together. So I should also mention that not only did J.D. Rockefeller go to homeopathic physicians, but historians have noted that, quote, all of the Standard Oil families sought homeopathic care. And Merrick, the woman, Dr. Merrick, was often that clinician. And one of the most respected medical historians in America, William Rothstein, wrote in his seminal book about American medicine in the 19th century, quote, early American homeopaths were all well-educated and cultured physicians and manifested an erudition rarely found in regular medical journals of the period. And those of us that have the pleasure of reviewing these old journal articles, it's amazing how many of them begin with some poetry or will sprinkle with poetry and have, a lot of literary references in their writing. It's really very sweet. And in 1916, Rockefeller scolded his staff of the foundations. He did have a tendency of hiring people and then having them do the jobs. I mean, he would tell them what he'd like to do. As he says, I am a homeopathist. I desire that homeopathists should have fair, courteous, and liberal treatment extended to them from all medical institutes to which we contribute. And again, a few years later, when he gave $45 million to this general education board, he warned his son and his staff that, quote, homeopathic teaching should not be excluded. It should be provided for the same as allopathic. But wasn't. But before we get to that question, just to give you a sense that Rockefeller was not the only of the big industrialists and philanthropists who were advocates of homeopathy. George Westinghouse, the founder of Westinghouse, H.J. Heinz, the founder of Heinz Food, George Eastman, the founder of Eastman Kodak, Joseph Wharton, the founder of Bethlehem Steel and founder of Wharton School of Business, and the University of Pennsylvania, Charles Kettering, who I've already made mention of, and even the founder of Western Union, Hiram Sibley. So, as I mentioned that, here's the question: was Rockefeller a stooge, a puppet master, or a profiteer? And that's what this presentation will answer, or at least raise the question. So Rockefeller was known to not meddle in the affairs of his philanthropic organizations. And as it turns out, Gates, that was the head of his foundations, took advantage of that fact. So although he made it clear that he wanted his money to be supporting homeopathic institutions, and at a time then that Rockefeller and his foundations gave out around $500 million, once Gates took over his foundations, not a single cent of this $550 million went to any homeopathic educational institute, medical school, or organization. So who was Frederick T. Gates? Well, he was a Baptist clergyman, and ironically, or this may explain it, but J.D. also was a Baptist. And being a Baptist, one of the rules that J.D. Rockefeller's mother was known to strongly hold is that everyone should tithe at least 10% of their income to charitable purposes. And what's interesting is one of the leading biographers of Rockefeller, a guy named Ron Chernow, acknowledged that Gates muzzled his own strong views on homeopathy. And Gates' real aim was, quote, to deliver a mortal blow to homeopaths, to shut their medical schools, expel them from medical societies, and strip them of hospital privilege so as to clear the field for scientific medicine. And one of the things that's interesting is that what Rockefeller did to become so rich is he created a monopoly on oil refineries. He actually owned 90% of the oil refining capabilities in America. So he created a monopoly. And one of the ways he became so rich in doing that is that there were efforts to create electric cars and to create other types of fuel, alcohol fuel to run the cars. And it was really through the petrochemical industry that was able to stop that from happening so that American cars, and if not cars throughout the world, would maintain their reliance on petrochemicals. So that's what this thing said. And so Gates had the idea of creating a similar monopoly in medicine. And to do so, you need to close down all the leading competitors. And homeopathy at that time was the leading competitor. So Rockefeller, or Flexner wrote to Rockefeller what could possibly be considered a bold-faced lies. This is Simon Flexner. This is Abraham Flexner's older brother, and who had worked at the Rockefeller foundations and with Gates before the Flexner report was issued. And I'm sure he had a hand in the selecting of his brother to be a pretend objective person. And Simon Flexner wrote or was quoted as saying, "We've had friendly conferences with representatives of several homeopathic schools and are investigating all schools, regardless of their affiliations, in pricing the same manner and spirit." Oh, if only that were true. Because this was made shortly after Flexner had had some meetings with representatives of the New York Homeopathic Medical College and the Flower Hospital, and they were directly told that no colleges or hospitals that have the word homeopathic in their name would be given any money because they would be considered sectarian. Sectarian was the term that was used as alternative. Now, what's interesting is when Rockefeller was once asked by B.C. Forbes, who was a famous businessman and he founded Forbes magazine, to name who he considered to be the greatest businessman he had ever encountered. And Rockefeller didn't suggest it was Henry Ford or Andrew Carnegie, who had created U.S. Steel, but it was Gates. And Gates not only ran his foundation, but helped to run his businesses. And the petrochemical business ultimately were used to manufacture so much of the medicines of that day. In other words, as it turns out, aspirin is made with benzene, which is a petrochemical product, and acetaminophen also has petrochemical origins. So the whole analgesia market is covered, and Vaseline is petroleum based. And so anything that's in an ointment would also be there. Ultimately, antibiotics and antibacterial products, suppositories, cough lubricants of any site, all these things were things that were used in the conventional model that supported the Rockefeller industries. So Rockefeller's lawyer, a guy named Starr Murphy, continued to misinform people. And he was quoted as saying, "The discriminations which were formerly practiced against homeopaths are being constantly lessened." Well, yeah. What they did was the AMA chose to admit doctors who were former homeopaths to join the organization, but they could only do so if they agreed to stop prescribing any homeopathic medicines. That's not actually lessening the discrimination, that's increasing it. Without providing this important detail, Murphy went on to claim that Simon Flexner, the executive at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, provided reassurance that the Rockefeller Institute, quote, "makes no distinction and welcomes to their staff qualified men irrespective of the school in which they have been trained." As long as you don't ever use the word homeopathic or use any of the homeopathic medicine, you can be a physician. So let's give some background of J.D. Rockefeller Jr. And he was first called Junior, and he was the only son of his mother and father. They had 3 sisters, so he was the heir apparent, obviously. And he worked for Standard Oil until only 1910, when he then devoted his time to philanthropy. And although he was an advocate of religious ecumenicalism, which means he supported cooperation amongst different religions. He was not an advocate of medical ecumenicism, because Gates was his mentor, and Gates taught him to abhor homeopathy and abhor alternatives, and ultimately help make the Rockefeller family even more rich. So there was actually some efforts in the 1920s. Julia Minerva Green, who was one of the co-founders of the American Foundation for Homeopathy, and she and Mary Coffin Ware Dennett, who was at that time in the 1920s, was America's leading women's rights advocate. And she was a pioneer in areas of birth control and sex education and women's rights to vote. And she was a voracious and vociferous advocate for homeopathy. And they contacted J.D. Rockefeller's personal secretary and who made it clear, and as did Rockefeller's son, the foundations would not allow that to happen, and he would have, quote, none of it. And then, as it turns out, they then tried to contact Hamilton Biggar, who was Rockefeller's physician, but that was in the year that they sought to contact him was when Biggar was 87 years old and he had just passed away. But here is some more smoking guns that I uncovered. Last year, I flew to New York. I went then to upstate New York to a town that is known to house the Rockefeller Archive. It's one of J.D.'s Rockefeller's former homes. And you go there and you tell them what files you want to look at. You do some research beforehand, and so they bring them out for you. And the file on homeopathy was really sparse when you consider how much passion Rockefeller had for it. But what was in there was 5 reports. And these were 5 reports that Gates had written on homeopathy that he wrote he did not want published. He didn't want published because, well, actually, he doesn't say why he doesn't want to publish, but it's obvious that anyone that would read them would have found gross errors of fact in them, as we'll soon see. And the homeopaths would have ripped them apart, and these were written for an audience of one, for Rockefeller's eyes only. So in the first report, Gates expressed great admiration for Sir William Osler. More specifically, Gates wrote, in the first place, I have read the works of Dr. Osler, who stands now, I believe, as the greatest modern physician, and it was reading of his books that led me to suggest the founding of the Rockefeller Institute. That's what Gates says. But in Oswell's farewell address to the American medical profession, Osler wrote, it is not as if our homeopathic brothers are asleep. Far from it. Many of them are awake. They are awake, many of them at any rate, to the importance of the scientific study of disease. It is distressing to think that so many good men live isolated in a measure from the great body of the profession. The original grievous mistake was ours. To quarrel with our brothers over infinitesimals was the most unwise and stupid thing to do. 1905, Osler. And if that incredible quote from 1905 wasn't enough, Time magazine in 1940, just prior to Osler's death, Osler gave a more incredible statement about homeopathy where he asserted that no individual has done more good to the medical profession than Samuel Hahnemann. All right, I could have said that. And if that quote isn't enough, one of Osler's biographers noted that Osler's 2 favorite treatments were Nux vomica and hope. And Nux vomica, we know, is a botanical medicine from a tree that the seeds have strychnine in them. And the only way that anyone would use this as a medicine is in homeopathic dose. So when he said Nux vomica is one of his favorite medicines, he means homeopathic Nux vomica. And hope just makes reference to just having a positive attitude, because he knew that conventional medicines of his day didn't work and, in fact, were dangerous. So here is Gates saying that we should follow Osler, but he didn't even know really what Osler stood for. So further on, you know, Gates in his report number one is so enamored with germ theory that he makes this preposterous assertion, quote, the diseases that are now known to be caused by germs are extremely numerous and of the greatest possible variety. They form at least 9/10, I should say, of the practice of every physician. Really? So heart disease I didn't know that that was caused by the infection, cancers, diabetes, numerous autoimmune diseases, let alone musculoskeletal ailments. I mean, 9/10, really? All right. Then in report number three, Gates actually claims that Samuel Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy, has no respect for the wisdom of the body, and that the body has, quote, no self-healing capabilities. He says, quote, there is nothing in Samuel Hahnemann's writings to indicate that he supposed nature to be an agency of much, if any, value in the cure of disease. The whole basis of Hahnemannian and Kantian thought is that you're supporting the vital force, which is that wisdom of the body. This is, once again, you can imagine if he published this report, how the homeopaths would have provided some critique of it, would you say? All right. So Gates criticized Hahnemann for having the ludicrous idea of something called the law of similars, as though that is somehow important healing. And he proclaimed that one of the known certain cures of scientific medicine was quinine in the treatment of malaria. And Gates insisted that quinine produces neither fever or chills. However, Gates is simply fabricating this assertion. It's widely known for a long time that some of the side effects of quinine are both chills and fever. I mean, you can look it up in the Merck manual. That's what I did. And then, Gates gave reference to a third proven conventional drug, the use of iron to treat anemia. Again, Gates insisted that iron will cure anemia, but will not cause it. Gates has been proven wrong again. If you look under excessive iron intake, called secondary iron overload, is, according to the Merck manual, a well-known cause of anemia. So it gets worse, I'm afraid. Gates asserts that Samuel Hahnemann was absolutely and wholly mistaken in his theory of cure and in the selection of drugs which he alleges would cure, and is perfectly clear to say that no case ever treated by homeopathy was cured by treatment. Homeopathy, as it turns out, gained its greatest popularity in the United States and in Europe during the impressive successes it had in treating infectious disease epidemics that raged during the 19th century, including epidemics of typhoid, cholera, yellow fever, scarlet fever, and pneumonia. In fact, in my book, The Homeopathic Revolution, I talk about numerous popes that gave the highest award that a pope can give to a non-religious person, gave them to medical doctors who were homeopaths who helped heal people from typhoid, from cholera, from yellow fever, and from these infectious diseases. And then in report number 5 is where Gates really shows his affection for fuzzy math. He refers to the quintillionth dose of nux vomica, the 18X or 9C, and he equated this dilution akin to a drop in a canal that is 9 miles long, 1 mile wide, and 8 feet deep. And then Gates would added a little flourish by saying that this amount of water would extend from the Atlantic seaboard to Chicago. The only problem with this fuzzy math is that Hahnemann and every homeopathic drug manufacturer since that time would need only 9 test tubes of water to make up a dilution, a total of 9 test tubes. So, I have I've gone to the Rockefeller archive to see what I could see. And in the first visit, I found no letters actually from Rockefeller in his own words about what his foundations were doing. I'm going back in April of 2024 for another visit, specifically to see if I can find anything there. Now, what's important to know is that homeopaths were often treating royalty, not just British royalty. Of course, for 200 years, the British royals have sought homeopathic care, but royalty throughout the world actually have been advocates for homeopathy, even Russia's czars. And if you think about how much power czars had, and yet even though these czars were advocates of homeopathy, even with them and their significant power, they were not able to break down what one doctor and a homeopath, two the czars were that there was a Chinese wall by which the medical hierarchy surrounds its domain. And so the question is, did Rockefeller, was he just kept in the dark, and did, with his advisors telling him that they were talking to the homeopaths, but they just didn't find their work worthy of support? How much did he know? Well, as it turns out, and this is a wonderful karmic thing, but I've been getting some financial support for writing this article and doing some other advocacy for homeopathy by the daughter of David Rockefeller. David was, well, anyway, it's part of the Rockefeller family. And so I love the fact that the Rockefellers today, some of them, still have some special interest in homeopathy. But what she told me is what I've found in a lot of books written about J.D. Rockefeller, and that he had a meticulous accounting, and that's what in part made him so successful. And he would know exactly what's going on. And she thinks even in his late age, he had that. So whether it's unlikely that Rockefeller was a stooge, it seems that he may have been convinced by Gates, who was not only head of his foundation, but his business advisor, that his petrochemical businesses would become even more rich if he had supported what was called scientific medicine at that stage. Now, please know that at this stage, there were very few proven drugs. Yes, there was aspirin, but ironically, they didn't know how aspirin worked. That wasn't really understood until the 1980s and 90s. And so even many of the drugs that seemed to work, they didn't even understand how they worked. But if you think about it, if the Rockefeller Foundation was giving out this incredible amount of cash and would not do it if you had the name homeopathy as a medical school or a hospital, you can understand why so many took the name homeopathy off. And then, conventional medicine continued to steamroll, can continue to have their big ad budgets, and they were able to ultimately create a medical monopoly. So, wow, what a story. Some of you know that I wrote a book called The Homeopathic Revolution, Why Famous People and Cultural Heroes Chose Homeopathy. And the two longest stories in the book are of Rockefeller and of Charles Darwin. But there's hundreds of other stories, each of them creating a wow factor, like so much of this own presentation today. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We stand on the shoulders of a cultural revolution, of people from literary ways of life, leaders in politics, leaders in women's rights issues, religious leaders, corporate leaders, world-class artists, world-class musicians. And so reading that book, gives you additional evidence for what enabled so many of these incredible cultural heroes to do their important work. And homeopathy is in part, just in part, one of them. And when we think of the 19th century, and you think of the abolitionists, the people that were against slavery, you're thinking about the transcendentalists who were at the forefront of new American thought. And when you think of the suffragists and the women's rights leaders, this group were the group that were involved with homeopathy. So it's that same group of people that are on the cutting edge of American culture that have been successfully deposed, successfully muted, successfully silenced. But I encourage us all to rise up. And my book on my ebook on research is also has so much wow experiences. It's over 700 pages. There's over 500 references. This is a user-friendly book where each of the chapters, the 100 chapters are of 100 common conditions. I cover what is the research behind or research that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. Not every condition has research. I don't want to say that, but 500 spread out really does cover a lot. And there's so much research that even homeopaths don't adequately know about. And it's think about how helpful it will be for you in your own practice. If you're seeing an ADD kid, and if you print out the ADD chapter and you show the several studies, like in the European Journal of Pediatrics, showed wonderful success, and several other studies. And then in the arthritis, the asthma studies, and so many of these, you give that to a patient. It's usually the mother that's seeing you with the kid. She brings it home to her partner, and before you know it, the neighborhood begins knowing about the evidence behind homeopathy. So you can use this book to educate yourself. You can use this book to be a part of your own writings about homeopathy and your own speaking about homeopathy, and you can use it to grow your practice, to educate your patients to what does exist in terms of research in homeopathy. And then many of you may know that I've created this e-course, Learning to Use a Homeopathic Medicine Kit, which uses the ebook as the textbook. And then I've created 80 videos averaging 15 minutes each, where I explain what homeopathy is. I explain some things about case taking. I explain things about certain important principles of homeopathy. And then I get into a whole bunch of specific ailments and talk about the different remedies to consider. And every presentation begins with one story from history, one story of a famous person that often even ties together the subject matter. So I then sometimes do talk about the research too. So, this is the type of short presentations that you can listen to or watch when you're making breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or for that matter, driving in your car. You can learn. I know many of you, most of you, are already well trained in homeopathy, but if you want to hear how I, as a person that's somewhat experienced in describing homeopathy in user-friendly ways, how I do this, maybe you'll be inspired to do more. Okay, so come visit my site at homeopathic.com. I have that secondary site of homeopathicfamilymedicine.com, which promotes the e-course. So upward and onward, and I hope this lecture blew your mind and blew your heart open. Thanks.